Thank you everybody for coming. We are expecting a few more people, so I will be a little bit slow in my introduction and give people time to join. If you haven't used Zoom to watch a lecture before, I recommend that you adjust the view to the speaker view, which you can do using the button in the top right corner that says view, and adjust that to speaker view, and then you'll be able to see a larger version of the presentation. As Rachel has just said, we are recording this to make it available on our website, just to draw your attention to that. We are absolutely delighted to have Vibhuti Sachdev joining us this evening for an absolutely fascinating talk. Vibhuti qualified as an architect from the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi, and after a period in practice and research in India, she undertook a PhD in architectural theory at SOAS in London, and later became a lecturer in the history of art at the University of Sussex. She returned to India in 2004 and worked as an independent writer and lecturer and a consultant on the restoration of the Jai Mahal in Jaipur. In 2015, she joined the Sushant School of Art and Architecture at Ansell University as professor, and in 2016 became the dean. She is joining us tonight. We're absolutely thrilled, especially given the time difference, which means it's already quite late in India, to talk about three Maharajas of courtly Jaipur. So Vibhuti, I will hand over to you.
On mute. Thank you, Rowena, for the introduction, and Rachel for organizing this, and CHF for giving me this opportunity. I'm just going to share my screen and jump straight in. So, am I audible? Everything fine? And
yes,
video, audio?
fine.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay. So, my talk is titled Steering Change, Three Maharajas of Kotli Jaipur. What I want to do is to demonstrate that any tradition, and especially I can say the Indian traditions, are not monolithic in character, that change is the core value of any continuing tradition. And in today's globalized world, there are lessons one can learn from how Jaipur responded to these changes and how it sort of managed to keep the core values of tradition going, and indeed till today. So tracing the response of Jaipur's courtly culture to modernizing demands against the background of embedded tradition is what I will engage with. Briefly, since its inception in 1727, the court of Jaipur, with every reign, has taken on challenges of new growth and development. Adopting new mindsets and modern technologies has meant that the courtly culture of Jaipur has been at the forefront of innovations. But it has done so with careful negotiations with its age-old traditions, making each change, albeit radical, appear seamlessly aligned with its past. How were these changes situated within an orthodox Hindu court? How were they represented and explained? What I propose to show is that it is possible to carry the past into the future, not in a fossilized way, but as a way to root modernizing forces propelling the culture into the future. So let's look at the field of change. Whenever change happens within an orthodox traditional setup, the field of change is the space between the rules and taboos. It is a space between what is considered sanctity and what is sacrilege. And what does this change do? This change sometimes disrupts, suspends routine in terms of how routine is played out within the context of time. And also sometimes it disrupts context in how things are played out in terms of space. This disruption is done through amplification of what would normally be a reduced entity, and I will show in my examples, contesting the dominant, and sometimes exaggerating what is understated, so retelling the story. So the approaches to such disruptions or changes within a tradition is to test, contest, and to blur boundaries. The changes within a tradition, it is almost imperative that the tools that these changes use work with a shared knowledge system so that it's communicated within the shared knowledge system. Often cultural tactics are used, strong tacit messages, diplomacy, empathy, strong sentiment. These changes, in fact, anticipate and indeed welcome resistance and address counterforce rather than oppose it. And any sort of resistance is, in fact, welcome as a way of embedding the change. Invariably, these changes use peaceful, non-violent, and democratic methods to embed changes within a tradition. What happens when these changes are done within a traditional setup? It recalibrates power positions, it realigns systems and processes. And also this, in fact, renews practices, and therefore it results in a continuity of tradition. So my Maharaja number one, quite appropriately, is the founder of Jaipur, Sawai Jai Singh II. He reigned between 1699 and 1743. So I'm looking at, my example is from a pre-modern city of Jaipur. And my example is how he fixed time. He, in a way, introduced a new way of reading time that bid to replace the use of diverse almanacs published by Brahmin communities with a giant Jantar Mantar, where an agreed time is achieved, not through scholarly discussions, but by visual evidence-based rationality. Now you have to imagine Maharaja in a court where his daily routine would be governed by, the astrological placements of nakshatras, of constellations, of stars, and the Brahmins would advise him when to get up, when to have breakfast, when to go for a bath, when to go for a walk, when to eat, when to fight a battle. And you can, and these almanacs were diverse in nature. So there were many Brahmin schools, therefore there were many almanacs, which would sometimes be conflict with each other about the exact appropriate auspicious time to do a certain activity. And this often obviously caused conflict and also undermined the authority of the Maharaja, of course. And what Sawai Jai Singh does is, and this is Sawai Jai Singh, this is a life-size portrait of the Maharaja painted by Sahib Ram. And you can see it's towards the end of his career because he's sort of graying but he's clothed in these very fine muslin jama and very fashionably dressed, where his headgear matches his shoes. this is where Sawai Jai Singh was born and spent much of his early years in. This is Amer, and bear in mind that 18th century was when the Mughal power was waning and Aurangzeb was on the throne. So who did not have many territorial ambitions. So Sawai Jai Singh grabbed this opportunity to lay out a brand new city in the plains adjacent to Amer. And this is the site of Jaipur, which is a flat piece of land surrounded by hills. So it's, in terms of defense, it's a very good site. And what he built just before laying out the city is this. This is Jantar Mantar. And these are giant instruments to read time, in the lunar time and the solar time. And this is what you can say. This was the Big Ben of Jaipur. This is a giant clock that reads constellations, stars, solar time, seasons, zodiac signs, and instead of and you can imagine, instead of Brahmins coming with their various almanacs saying, no, it's not time yet for you to have a bath, or it's not time yet for you to fight a battle. He would take them to the clock and say, show me what the time is, instead of choosing a certain Brahmin community over others. So in a way, he revolutionized the way time is read, and standardization of time is what binds communities. Time, by its very nature, is not linear; it is made linear, and it is agreed as a common entity that everybody abides by. And this was a very sort of a modern, radical thing to do in his court. The other thing he also did, of course, is placed. This was a hunting lodge that was right in the middle of the site, and you can see it's a hunting lodge because you can see the water spouts as the shape of a bull, and it's a pavilion. What he did was, this was a pre-existing structure on the site, and what he did was he converted this pavilion into a temple and built the entire city around it as a way of projecting that it is Govind Dev who is presiding over the city. So in a way, contextualizing the city, giving it divine authority. And this is Govind Dev, which is he's a 16th century idol, and with Radha, and he also had a long journey from Calcutta to Banaras, Calcutta to Vrindavan to Amer, and then he rehoused him, both of them, in the heart of the city. So in a way, Jai Singh fixes time and fixes context, and deliberately to kind of draw boundaries and give it a fixed entity. And the palace is right next to Govind Dev temple, and you can see. So this photograph is taken from the city palace and looking towards the temple. So the alignment of the divine with the Maharaja is very, very clearly communicated and laid out. My second Maharaja is Sawai Ram Singh, and he reigned between 1835 and 1880. Ram Singh is also nicknamed as a photographer prince. Ram Singh introduced photography in his court. In a way, he was responsible for what one could say reversing the gaze. He refashioned how one could self-image oneself. It wasn't really, you can't really call it a selfie, but kind of a self, you could curate a self-portrait. How also royalty could be photographed in a new, new exciting way. And he also photographed women in his court. And I will show you some examples of his work. So this is Ram Singh, and this is how, you know, the king would like to be photographed generally, sort of sitting, you know, full frontal and staring, you know, and confidently, almost threateningly, with a shield and armor and bejeweled and with all the markings of royal authority, with the sword in hand in case one needed it suddenly, and so you can see he's surrounded with royal accoutrements and all the paraphernalia. And this was very early on, and what Ram Singh chooses to do is this. He photographs himself as a king in the most unprecedented way. With the camera and the photography, of course, you know, spectacles was a new thing as well. So suddenly, you know, people started seeing the whole world in a new way. So Ram Singh here is bespectacled. He's sitting on a chair, not on the floor. His legs crossed, one arm on the table, another on his stick, and the fingers almost, you know, suggesting he might be holding a cigar, or, you know, so very modern and not at all threatening in terms of his posture or in terms of what surrounds him. So this was a big change of how one would see a Maharaja and how a Maharaja would see himself. And then, of course, you know, within the image making, production making machinery, of course, people were used to seeing painted portraits of the kings, and this is a painted photograph, or a portrait that is made after the photograph. And you can see how, again, you know, his glance is not, he's not looking straight at you, but sideways, and his arm on the same table with a flower vase, and holding the dagger rather reluctantly, and not about to pull it out at all. And the chair with casters, and his feet crossed and wearing anklets in you know, one ankle. So very fashionable, very demure, very artistic, and this was a far cry from the traditional Maharaja sort of portraits, which you know, were, you know, Maharaja like, or, you know, grand and confident and threatening, and he's very different from that posture. And this is one of the famous, very famous portraits, self-portraits that he curated of himself as a Sawai devotee, seated on the floor with all the kind of vessels and things that are required to perform a ritual, and looking outside the window, very soulfully reflecting, and also he has all these ash marks on his body. So it's very immediate, it's very intimate, it's very quiet as a portrait. And this is one of the several, you know, many portraits that he curated of the women in his Zenana. But you can see the same table that is doing the rounds, and the chair on the right. It's, you know, one chair, one table studio, and the backdrop, painted backdrop with swords of fabric, painted bookshelf, fireplace, and the Zenana woman as well, very confident, standing upright, legs crossed. And this was also a very new way of imaging women as you know, as personalities, as you know, confident members of the royal household. Okay, my third Maharaja is Madosa, who reigned between 1880 and 1922. He was the son of Ram Singh, adopted son of Ram Singh. Ram Singh, you know, as you've seen, he was, you know, an erudite, artistic person who would spend hours and hours in his photography studio, developing them himself as well. Madosa, on the other hand, was, you know, was a wrestler. So as a boy, and so he had a bit of a kind of a complex, thinking, you know, I've taken over from this, you know, very learned, competent, skilled person, and you know, and he said in one of his diaries that he is like a Mali, a gardener whose job is to water the garden that his predecessor has grown. I've done, you know, a lot of research on him, and I think, you know, he was very modest in that statement, because in terms of strategy, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of how to handle various voices in the court, he was absolutely very, very sharp, and handled very difficult, complex situations with great sensitivity. So negotiating boundaries was his forte, and how to negotiate between what is allowed, what is not allowed, how to not quite please everyone, but how to kind of carry everyone into a new direction and make sure that everyone felt a part of new enterprises. Many of you would know that within an orthodox Hindu court, crossing the seas and oceans was a taboo. And also another difficulty was during his time, he had to entertain the British, because that was part of his courtly job profile. So politically, he had to, you know, entertain them, negotiate with them, bring them inside the palace, and of course, the voice of the Brahmins is very strong within the court, because they would always, you know, sort of their voice was very significant in terms of criticism. So they would say, you know, how can you entertain the British, and they drink and they eat meat, and, you know, you'll be polluted, and how can you cross the seas, and, you know, so there was a very strong sense of, you know, the repercussions you could face if you broke all these rules. And also he showed a new way of documenting the past, which actually changed the way one looked at the past. And if you change the way what you look at the past, you re-look at your present, and it shapes your future. So this is his portrait as a young man, Sawai Jai Singh. And you can see the difference between him and Ram Singh. Ram Singh was this kind of, you know, short, thin, frail or fragile looking Maharaja, and whereas Madho Singh is this stocky wrestler like solid man. This is a picture of SS Olympia, which he bought in order to go to England to attend the coronation. And he bought this ship, and he performed several rituals in order to kind of communicate that the crossing of the seas and oceans was done very, very carefully, with everybody's agreement on the ritual processes that were carried out. So he also carried with him Gopal, which is a sort of a miniature Krishna from the temple, with him to England, saying that he was merely following the king, and it was he was following the god, sorry, and it was Govind Dev who was leading him to England rather than him being the person who's leading the travel. In his ship, this ship, he had it washed in milk. There were 3 floors in the ship. The lower floor for his subjects, the middle was his, and the top floor was for Gopal, which is Krishna. And there were separate kitchens, and he carried with him dry food, oil, ghee, and this is all documented in his in the narrative he wrote for his subjects. And this is, this is how he would have, what he would have looked like. So also in the newspapers around that time, when he landed in Victoria, there was a kind of a carcade with Gopal in the front car, and then him, and then his subjects, and he was sort of bejeweled, and this is captured in many of the newspapers at the time. And this is him just before boarding the ship. He's performing a ritual prayer to the ocean, Samudra Pujan, and you can see him seated in the center. Here, that's Madho Singh with all his courtiers performing a prayer to the seas to wish him happy journey and to allow him to cross the seas. And what he took with him also, because one of the criticisms by the Brahmins was that, what are you going to drink? Are you going to drink polluted water? How can you sort of drink water of other rivers? So, so he took with him what is regarded as the purest water of the country, which is Ganga water, Ganges water. And he carried with him these water bottles, 12 of them, filled with Ganges water. Of course, one couldn't, there's no way of checking. But this is what a typical Ganga Jali would look like. And normally these Ganga Jalis would be sort of miniature size, the small water bottles that everybody carries when you go to Ganga, and you bring home some of the Ganges water, and it's a very useful thing to have. You can purify everything with few droplets. You can purify your home, your bathing water, to convert it to Ganges water, and so it's a very useful thing to have, which sort of lasts you a year. So this is what he carried to say, and these are silver urns, and to say that he was only drinking Ganga water. And just to show you the scale, these are large silver urns, and there were 12 of them which he carried with him on the ship. And this is a view from Sarvatobhadra, which is the older part of the palace, to through the door to the newer building, which is Mubarak Mahal, which is built specifically to entertain the British. What he also does is Madho Singh commissioned a lot of albums, commissioned a lot of documentation of craftsmanship, or documentation of objects like jewelry and swords and architectural elements. Swinton Jacob, who compiled this Jaipur Portfolio of Architecture, many volumes of architectural parts. On the right is part 1 called Copings and Plinths. Was a way of, and these are some of the pictures from the Jaipur Portfolio of Architectural Details. And what this method does is that it, he went around Rajasthan and documented, and these are measured drawings, documented various elements from traditional buildings, put them in albums, and these were loose leaf boxes of architectural details, with a hope that any architectural designer would pick out elements from each box and mix and match, according to his fancy, and one didn't have to kind of, follow what went with what, and you could just play it as kit of parts rather than a strict vocabulary. This freed the elements from vocabulary, from language, from method, from rule, and there is, of course, a strong criticism against this approach, but it also meant that there was a new way of assembling these building parts into designs. And he also trained Chiman Lal, for example, in drawing. So introducing drawing into the architectural process was what also happened during Madho Singh's time. And this was a new way of not only communicating design, but designing itself, that how do you, designing through drawing rather than designing through vocabulary. So architectural process had so far been, it's a highly codified system where you can negotiate a design through words, and you did not need to draw it before building it. So you draw it directly onto the site. Whereas Jacob, during Madho Singh's reign, introduced a way of sort of fixing the design in drawing before building it. And that changes the whole architectural process. And it had far-reaching consequences as to how you design, what you use in terms of design. And this is a building, this is Mubarak Mahal. This is a sort of in a way, a result of that process. Of course, designed by Chiman Lal, but using the method of kit of parts. And you can see there are, this is a perfectly, symmetrical building. All 4 facades are equal. But you can see the pasted elements on the ground floor, which to a trained eye look out of place. But it's a very sort of a jewel-like pretty building. And this is a building that Madho Singh commissioned for entertaining the British, and of course the criticism to counter the criticism that you couldn't entertain the British within the palace because they would drink and they would eat meat and how awful and all of that. And of course diplomacy relationship with the British was also important. So what he does is he builds it just outside the boundary, so that the criticism could be countered. And my last slide is this magnificent painting which in a way, this is a courtly scene with Krishna and his courtiers waiting outside. In a way, to say that, the narrative of the courtly tradition continues alongside the modernizing factors that the tradition faces. And in fact, it is the change that keeps the tradition alive. And one has to carry the past in order for the tradition to be alive. And as I said, not in a fossilized way, but as an active participant of the tradition. So this is my last slide. I end with this, and I will stop share.
Thank you so much, Vibhuti. That was absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed the way you took us through the 3 different Maharajas. I would like to invite any questions to be put in the chat for Vibhuti, and I will read them out as they come in. Whilst you're thinking through your questions, I will exercise the chair's prerogative and ask the first question. With your first Maharaja, Sawai Jai Singh, you explained about his creation of the Jantar Mantar. Was it his intention to lessen the power of the Brahmins through creating that, or was it a more positive determination to modernize, or was there some other kind of motivating factor?
Of course, it wasn't about lessening the power. I think it was, of course, modernizing and also reducing the conflict. And of course, any kind of power play plays on conflict. And once you get the conflict out, there is peace, then there is no reason to play out that power. So in a way, indirectly undermines the power, of course, but is also brings in agreement within the Brahmin communities. And so they themselves could read the time and question their own almanacs. So it was both progressive and I think very, very progressive move. So not with a I think a negative aim to lessen the power, but to resolve conflict.
Thank you very much. That's a really interesting explanation of it. Thank you. There haven't been any questions yet. Would anybody like to submit a question through chat, or if perhaps that's a bit challenging, perhaps you could turn your video on and ask a question in person.
So I think, while people think their question, I think why it is important to see these modernizing, ever-changing aspects of traditions is because, in a way, because, today we've become so anxious about change and become so anxious about our own identity in this globalized world that the tolerance for differences is reducing. So, even in the field of conservation, to use new materials, to use new methods, to use technology is always, filled with anxiety and concern. So, there are lots of lessons of these kinds to be learned from these great continuing traditions as to how they managed to embrace change as a way of moving forward, rather than, of being of some concern or of feeling that they would not be authentic or pure if they changed.
Yes, and I think the Jaipur Portfolio is a really interesting example of that, and the way that it kind of in some ways fixed, I suppose, some ideas of what Indian architecture was on the page, and then they were taken up by British engineers and so on around India. We've got a few questions coming in now. There are, Elizabeth Chaco has asked regarding the Maharajas photos of his Zenana, was the main queen photographed, or was it just the lesser ones?
There were many of the women in the Zenana were photographed. It is not clear who his main queen was. But you know, there was certainly a sort of a hierarchy in the Zenana. There were kind of elderly women and younger women, so I mean, from his photographs, it's clear that there are some favorites of his who were photographed more than others, because of, you know, and very striking women, and so I think more of as photogenic subjects rather than them being queens.
Thank you. Anuba Karu has asked, so the method in which Mubarak Mahal was constructed, can you call that templatization? And then does it become a valid method for design, more DIY, and also removing the canonical agencies of the Brahmins or now of the architects?
Hi, Anubhas. I think that's a very interesting question. Rather than templatization, I would say whether it kind of is moving towards making architecture as iconic. But of course, it is not. I don't think it removes the agencies of the Brahmins. Is that the question? Does it remove the agencies of the Brahmins? Let's see. DIY, removing the canonical. Something really interesting is going on at that moment, because there is this juxtaposition of the coming together of paths. So that if you see Albert Hall, which is the museum in Jaipur, you know, the plan is Palladian, the plan is very European, whereas the elevations are very Indian, or, you know, they look very Indian. So there is a disjunction between plan and elevation that is happening. And even in Mubarak Mahal, if you see, there is a, you know, central atrium-like space where normally it would be a courtyard, or so there is a disjunction, and there is a like also the kit of parts. There is a breaking down of architectural processes, and I think, and this is beginning of 20th century, so which is happening everywhere. The modernizing, the modern approach of design, of standardization that is happening around. So and also how you communicate design, how you design influences how you design. So all those shifts can be seen through this building. You're right.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I was wondering, in terms of Ram Singh's photography, did he affect how other princes in India chose to portray themselves?
You mean in other Maharajas in other princely states? One does see that happening gradually, yes. Maharaj of Alwar, for example, there is a lovely oil painting I think it's in V&A or can't remember, but lovely oil painting of Maharaj of Alvar, very Art Deco, very, not at all the kind of traditional clothes or stance or posture. So there is, I mean, with growing interaction with Europe, with exchange of ideas, of image making, of technology, there is a shift happening. But this shift is, happens first in Jaipur. They are the pioneers because the Maharaja himself is a photographer. And 1850s, we're talking about 1850s. So the technology is on a par with Europe. And he is also having an exchange with European photographers. Then also in Calcutta, there is a society of photographers. So he's very active in the international circuit. And God knows how they did it without phones and internet and without, and being, synchronously participant in these cultural shifts is very interesting to see how they managed.
Thank you. Anuba has also got another question. Glorious change is inevitable. Where does that place conservation as it goes today? Do we preserve, conserve, or restore?
Yeah, that is a traditional question and a dilemma that is posed by many situations. And I think the bottom line is that buildings must be used. They are not objects of glory to be looked at from far. And the moment you monumentalize architecture and can't touch it, can't use it, you risk decay, you risk alienating architecture from the community. So bit of both. And there are various kinds of buildings. Of course, Taj Mahal should be left as it is, but there are also B-grade buildings that should be converted into schools, galleries, also in Europe, you can see banks, shops, reusing, and you can, that from your own experience that the moment you leave your flat locked for more than a month, it starts to decay, So buildings need people. They are objects of use, and whether it's conserving or preserving or restoring, whatever makes it best for use, people should not be considered a threat to buildings or monuments or traditional buildings. And we have to find a way of coexisting with our past and using our buildings. It's bizarre when, they are kind of locked up because they're precious and people are going to spoil it and people are going to ruin it. That's a crazy attitude. How can people be a threat to their heritage? So I think the closer they come to heritage building, they grow on you. You have an emotional bond with your architectural spaces. There is no reason why people would destroy things that they have an emotional bond with it. And sometimes these things are all sentiments also fueled by politics and by short-term silly agendas, which is sad. But India is filled with treasures of every 100 meters there will be something that is old that needs to be rescued. And I think the modern day development ought to take cognizance of that heritage buildings should always be a priority when it comes to development, and not be regarded as a disadvantage, because we have to. This is what also I'm trying to demonstrate, that we have to carry our past into the future, because that is what our richness, that is where our richness lies in. We can't dump the past and erase it. Then we are no one. So, and there are enough examples in our own history which show how we carry our past into the future, how change becomes the core value of our traditions, and how it is possible to carry our families, our pasts, our people, our traditions, our cultures into the future. That is the only way forward, I think.
Yes, and I agree. I mean, I think by, as it were, looking at conserving the heritage assets, you don't just preserve the building, you also preserve the techniques of construction and craftsmanship that otherwise might not be needed so readily in the modern world, and preserves another element of our heritage. And Sawai Jai has pointed out that starting by documenting, as the Maharajas did, is also a really important element in the sort of process of preserving our heritage.
I have a response that, the way you document it is also important, to kind of reflect on what is it you're documenting, because documentation sometimes fixes things. The moment you document something in plan, section, elevation, you've actually excluded the process. And how do you capture the process? How do you capture the communities that were involved in that architectural processes? That is very important. Who built those buildings, and what were their lives about? How did they monetize the buildings? What were the women doing? What were the men? And the entire architectural process needs to be documented. And I think the best way of documenting is to make sure the traditions are alive. That in terms of oral tradition, in terms of practice-based traditions, keeping them alive is the best way to document. And if you just document them on plan, section, elevation, it just gets lost.
Yes, yeah. I think that was what you were saying too when you were talking about the Jaipur portfolios, about fixing them in a point in time. Useful for historians, but
Yes.
not quite the death of creativity, but certainly perhaps putting a stop on it in some way. Sawai has pointed out an example of Gurugram preserving the Kumar tradition in a Masani village, which sounds fascinating. I don't know if you want to elaborate.
Yes, so Sawai is one of the students who studied in my university in the MR Built Heritage program. And Sawai, you want to explain that?
Hi, hello, ma'am. Hi, everyone. So, ma'am, as you just mentioned that we should also preserve the tradition. So, in Gurugram, so Masani was a village. So, Gurugram is where our university is located. So, we were trying to conserve a building, which was a palace called Mahalwada. So, when we started the process of documenting, as ma'am said, and we looked into what everyone around in that settlement was doing, what were their professions, what were their daily lives like, we realized that there was this community of potters, and it was an ecosystem which was dependent on the Mahalwada in the olden times, because the Mahalwada was sort of a center. The palace was a center, and had a marketplace around it. And the potters used to, sell the pottery and their wares there, and it was like an economy. So what we did was that we tried organizing some workshops alongside our study and try to get that tradition back, at least, so that the people living around Mahalwada and living around that palace, feel connected to it, and it becomes, it at least has value again. So that was
absolutely. I think that's what we were saying, that we have to keep the practices alive, and once you keep the practices, and the way to keep the practices alive is to forever modernize it, forever renew the practices. That is the only way to keep it alive and not have it fossilized. So yeah, so I think that is very important. Thanks.
Thank you both very much indeed. That was a really interesting example. I'm conscious it's now 6 o'clock in the UK and 11:30 in India. So I think we should draw things to a close. But thank you ever so much, Vibhuti. We are very grateful to you at the Commonwealth Heritage Forum for giving up really quite a late part of your evening to join us and share an absolutely fascinating talk about the three Maharajas. I feel like we could all debate this for a lot longer, but thank you ever so much. We really appreciate it. And if anybody joined partway through and wants to hear the beginning, we are recording the talk, so it will be available on our website. And do feel free to share the website link with others who might be interested in listening to the talk. Thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you, Rowena. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.